The topic that I chose for my capstone paper is the origin of tomatoes. Tomatoes are a part of the plant family Solanaceae, which has been studied for many years, with some of the first reference recordings dating back to the 16th century. A lot of focus has been delegated to this plant family due to its contribution in major crop species that hold both historical and economical value, while also providing biological models for the development of fruits, pigments, and plant defense mechanisms in all sorts of plants. These biological models can help us prepare for future obstacles that we may face when dealing with cultivating crops. The scientific name for the cultivated tomato is the Solanum lysopersicum, which was formerly known as Lysopersicum esculentum. This species will be the main focus of this paper, although many other wild-type species of tomato will be discussed and related to the cultivated tomato. These wild-type species of tomato will be the key in diversifying the genetic makeup of the cultivated tomato for future purposes. The tomato is an herbaceous perennial, but in regions where frost occurs, it is grown as an annual because the plant itself is not able to handle the stresses of the frost. The tomato consists of compound leaves, usually alternate and pinnate, and have weak stems often supported by stakes during cultivation. The cultivated species tend to bear flowers that contain both male and female parts, so they are able to self-pollinate, while the wild-type species tend to be restricted to cross-pollination, which does lend to higher genetic diversity. The fruit of the tomato is considered a berry with an average of 2 to 12 locules containing many seeds. The color of the berry depends on the specific type of tomato. Colors range from red to yellow to green and sometimes a dark purple. The wild-type tomatoes tend to have smaller berries, while the cultivated types tend to have larger fruits. There are many varieties of tomatoes, ranging from the most ancestral type of tomato to the most cultivated form of tomato, and in between there are many different forms of tomato plants, and all these different plants tend to bear different styles of fruits. A picture has been provided on the slide to show the amount of variety that is possible. When focusing on the origin of the tomato, two hypotheses have been advanced on determining where the tomato originated. The first being that it originated in Peru, and the second being that it originated in Mexico. These hypotheses were examined through historical evidence, geographical evidence, and genetics. The oldest historical evidence that we have for tomatoes is through the ancient civilizations of the Mayans and the Aztecs. Although the evidence that we can obtain from this time period is minimal, there is still knowledge to be gained there. Caution just has to be taken when examining ancient ruins to be sure that they are being examined properly. The Mayans and the Aztecs were the only ancient civilizations that were located in the New World around the regions of the tomato and where it was hypothesized to be originated. That being the Mayans from northern Chile to lower Ecuador and the Aztecs in Mesoamerica. Multiple early scientists agreed that the tomato originated in Peru due to the assumption that the name given to the tomato meant that it was from Peru. One of the early names was Pome de Peru, and there were many names given to the tomato throughout these times, and the assumption that they could be relied upon for determining the origin was an incorrect assumption, because this very name, Palme de Peru, was actually found later by another scientist, was used to represent multiple species of plants, not only the tomato. For example, it represented the eggplant as well. Another name used to describe the tomato in early years was tomata. And this word has a Mexican origin. So the use of this word historically suggests that the origin of the tomato was in fact Mexico and not Peru. And there were studies proving that the species of plant being talked about was in fact the tomato, and that they were firsthand observed in Mexico, which provides more substantial evidence than the claim that the tomato was from Peru due to the name of Palme de Peru, when that name wasn't clearly talking about the tomato. Another piece of historical evidence that strongly supports an origin in Mexico rather than Peru is the timing of the Mexican conquest compared to that of the conquering of Peru. A quote from an article written by Jenkins says, "The tomato must have been brought to Europe sometime before 1544, which was only 9 years after the conquest of Peru, but more than 20 years after the conquest of Mexico. This period in Peruvian history was one of strife. The conquerors were dividing their loot and had no interest in agricultural plants. On the other hand, the Mexican conquest was completed by 1523. The country was soon pacified, and systematic exploitation of all colonial wealth was established before 1544. There was a regular arrival and departure of ships from the port of Veracruz." So that being said, based off the timing, it does seem highly more plausible that tomatoes were being exported out of Mexico rather than Peru, seeing that Peru is still going through very hard times where nobody would really be worried about exporting agricultural goods. Geographical evidence, on the other hand, highly suggests an origin in Peru. Centers of diversity were located in regions in Peru, small regions, where the diversity in tomato plants were very high. And as you made your way further from these small regions, the diversity of the tomato plant got lower. In making your way all the way to Mexico, the diversity in the tomato plants was even less then. Based off that evidence, it is highly likely that the origin of tomatoes was in that Andean region throughout northern Chile all the way to lower Ecuador through Peru, but it does not show how the other types of tomato, the ones that have less genetic diversity in them, made their way from those regions. Whether the tomato was cultivated in those regions and then further moved out from those locations, or did it happen naturally without human interaction? The genetic evidence agrees with the geographical evidence, showing that the tomatoes located in the Andean region are in fact the wild type species, and that the tomato species located in Mexico are the less genetically diverse cultivated species. The two main wild type tomatoes are known as the Cerasforme and the Pimpinellifolium. Both of these species play a major role in the domestication of the cultivated type of tomato. The exact role in which these two played in a process to get to the cultivated tomato is still not fully understood. In conclusion, considering the historical evidence, the geographical evidence, and the genetic evidence, it was determined that the center of origin for the tomato is in the South American Andean region running from northern Chile to southern Ecuador. This location is where the wild type species are located and most of the diversity in tomatoes persists. Although it is not fully clear, it is also hypothesized that Mexico was the center for domestication of the cultivated tomato. This being said, it is most likely that the cultivated tomato was introduced to Europe from Mexico and not from the Andean region. It is also possible that it was introduced to Mexico or to Europe from the Andean region, but due to the evidence, it is highly more probable that it was introduced from Mexico. A picture of the Andean region in South America was also provided to give more reference as to where exactly this region is located. Knowing the origin of the wild types of tomato and how they are related to the cultivated tomato and how they are related to one another will be a huge benefit for the future cultivation of tomatoes. It is extremely important that we utilize wild type species in order to better adapt tomatoes for an ever-changing environment. The diversity in wild type species will allow for incorporating genes that help benefit the cultivated tomato's chance of surviving in different environmental factors. And as societal demands increase, for example, Italy's demand for tomato products to be sourced in specific regions, it will help create tomato species that are able to be realistically produced on a scale that can support the population in those regions that they're being asked to be sourced from.